So one of my friends from the Austin, Texas congregation once said that this holy day, the Feast of Trumpets, was his favorite holy day. Now, of course, that's not to say that any holy day is better than another holy day. That would be like saying that one part of God's plan is better than the other parts, and we know that they're all equally awesome. But rather, the Feast of Trumpets just struck my friend as being particularly profound and inspiring to him, just how we might have a favorite scripture that is particularly meaningful to us. So after thinking about my friend's position for a while, I think that I agree with him, and let me tell you why. I think that the Feast of Trumpets, this one day, serves as a reminder for all of the things that God has done for mankind in the past and what God has in store for mankind in the future. These reminders, both the past and the future, not only give us hope and the confidences of God's promise, as we got to have our own little physical reminder with the rainbow this morning, but these reminders also command us to take action and continue to follow Christ and run our races with endurance, to briefly reference Hebrews 12 and verses 1 through 3. These reminders of God's fulfilled and future promises, coupled with the powerful call to action symbolized by the sound and the blasting of trumpets, I think makes this holy day particularly meaningful and inspiring. In my message this morning, I want to briefly discuss the two takeaways of this holy day that I mentioned in my introduction. First, the reminder of God's fulfilled promises and of the promises that he has in store for us in the future. And second, the call to action for those of us in God's church to continue growing closer to God and doing his will. So the title of my sermonette this morning is the Two Trumpets Takeaways. Two Trumpets Takeaways. So takeaway number one, the Feast of Trumpets is God's reminder of his promise to his coming kingdom and a reminder that he keeps all of his promises. Trumpets is God's reminder of his promise to his coming kingdom and a reminder that he does keep all of his promises. So let's first turn over to Numbers 10, and we'll start in verse 9 this morning. Now, Numbers 10 starts with God commanding Israel to create two silver trumpets and then goes on to describe their various uses. But we'll skip down and we'll start in verse 9. So Trumpets 10, starting in verse 9. When you go to war in your land against the enemy who oppresses you, then you shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, and you will be remembered before the Lord your God, and you will be saved from your enemies. Also in the day of your gladness, in your appointed feasts, and at the beginning of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings. Of course, one of the feast days that Israel was commanded to blow the trumpets was on the Feast of Trumpets, naturally, as described in Trumpets 29 and verse 1. And on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work, for you it is a day of blowing the trumpets. Continuing on here in Numbers 9 and verse 10. So we left off here, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings. And they shall be a memorial to you before your God. I am the Lord your God. Now, verse 10 here describes a call to remembrance, a memorial. But what are we called to remember? Let's dive into this verse a little bit more. And in particular, I want to zoom in on this sentence, and they shall be a memorial for you before your God. In Hebrew, the word for before is derived actually from the word for face, literally meaning to the face, in front of the face, or in the presence of something or someone. The act of blowing trumpets, and therefore the Feast of Trumpets, is a memorial of God's people being in the presence of God, and that God is actively working with his people. I think that the memorial of being in God's presence can be extrapolated to all time periods. The Feast of Trumpets is a reminder that we are currently, in the present tense, in the presence of God here today, and that God is working with us in the present. The Feast of Trumpets is also a reminder of God's presence in the past, namely in the promises that he has faithfully fulfilled, and a reminder that we will see God face to face in the future with the coming of his kingdom. Now let's focus on two different types of promises here. God's past promises, all of which he has faithfully fulfilled for his people, and then his future promises, which we have confidence in due to the fulfillment of his past promises. So let's consider an example of God fulfilling his promises in the past when God helped the Israelites conquer the city of Jericho. Now, there are many examples in the Bible where God has fulfilled his promises to his people, but I thought the example of Jericho was particularly fitting since it actually involves the blowing of trumpets. So let's turn over to Joshua chapter 6. That's where we find the account of the conquer of the city of Jericho, the destruction of the city of Jericho as it's labeled in my version here. And I'll just start reading in verse 1. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. Verse 2. And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. God had promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites, but the heavily fortified city of Jericho stood in their way, and they certainly needed God's help in order to overcome this fortification. So continuing on in Joshua 6, down to verse 3, you shall march around the city, all of you men of war, and you shall go around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And the people shall go up, every man straight before him. And the rest of this story describes the setup of the Israelites preparing themselves for this. And we'll skip down to verse 20 here. And this is when the people they march around the city for the number of days, and they go up with a shout. And in verse 20, and so the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. The blowing of trumpets was an active reminder here of God's power and his faithfulness to fulfill his promise to give the promised land to the Israelites. Clearly, the sound of the trumpets alone was not so loud that it destroyed the walls and caused them to fall over on their own. It was God, whose presence was with the Israelites, who gave the city into their hands because of their promises, of the promises that he had made to their fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We can also see how the Feast of Trumpets is a reminder of the future blowing of trumpets, which will herald in God's coming kingdom. And so we can see this discussed in 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4, starting in verse 16. 1 Thessalonians 4, let's start in verse 16 here. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. What a wonderful passage. We have confidence that Christ will return, as stated here, and that he will fulfill this promise that he has given to us, because he has been faithful to all of his promises in the past, like how he delivered the city of Jericho into the hands of the Israelites. God fulfilled his promise to provide his people with a physical kingdom, with physical land in Israel, so that we will have confidence in his promise to provide his people with his soon-coming spiritual kingdom in the future. And so, as we can see, the Feast of Trumpets provides God's people with powerful reminders of the promises that God has fulfilled and the promises that he will fulfill. But what are we supposed to do after having been reminded of this information? This leads me to my second and final takeaway. Takeaway number 2. The Feast of Trumpets is a call to action for us to hold fast to the faith and work together to keep each other strong in God's truth. It's a call to action for us to hold fast to the faith and work together to keep each other strong in God's truth. All of God's promises to us and his people are conditional on us obeying his commandments. For example, Even though God was the one who delivered Jericho into the hands of the ancient Israelites, he still required them to march around the city and to blow trumpets. They had an end to fulfill. He still required them to march around. The reminders of God's promises also remind us that we similarly have work that we need to be doing. So what actions should we be taking now in this day and age? What kind of action should we take away from the Feast of Trumpets today? We may not have the physical battles that the Israelites had to prepare for, but we certainly do have spiritual battles that we need to prepare for. So we just read from 1 Thessalonians 4 and 16 and 17, which explains God's promise for trumpets and how we will meet him in the air at the last trumpet. And this passage also provides us with some good direction as to what actions we can be taking in response to God's promises associated with this holy day. And so let's now look at verse 18, the last verse of this chapter before chapter 5. So 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 18. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. I really want to zoom in on the one word comfort here used in verse 18. The word for comfort here is a Strong's G3870, which is parakaleo, I believe, which is used over 100 times in the New Testament. It's a very, very commonly used word and has a variety of potential meanings. The meaning for the word parakaleo, which is translated as comfort, according to Strong's Concordance, is a list of the following: to address, to speak to call upon, to call to, which may be done in the way of exhortation, entreaty, comfort, and instruction. This is not just the pitying, sort of there kind of comfort, the pat on the back style of comfort. This is an active, involved consolation and encouragement, an active call to talk and work together. In short, the Feast of Trumpets is a reminder for us to fellowship together, to come together and to encourage and strengthen one another in celebration of God's words and God's promises for the future. This is a crucial part of our calling in God's church, and is especially important to remember along with God's future promises. So in closing, brethren, I think it's safe to say that all of God's promises are also calls to action, and we must continue living God's way if we are to receive what God has promised to us. There are two big takeaways that the Feast of Trumpets brings to mind for me. First, the promises God has fulfilled and will fulfill for all of mankind. And second, the call to action for us to come together, celebrate the coming kingdom, and encourage and inspire one another with the truth that God has given to all of us. And so overall, I can see why the Feast of Trumpets might be someone's favorite holy day. So happy Feast of Trumpets to you all.